China is surpassing American strength, whether it be naval forces or nuclear forces.
John Mills is a retired U.S. Army colonel. His 4-decade career has spanned key roles from the Cold War era to the War on Terror. At the Department of Defense, he directed cybersecurity policy.
I was brought into cyber in 2007 when the threat really was Russian cyber adventurism. But by 2012, it was all China. It wasn't even close. For every dollar Russia spent on misadventure, China spent 20.
In this episode, we dive into Chinese Communist Party influence globally and how this has created what Mills calls a world on fire.
All the pieces are kind of in place for Xi to make his move around the world to establish China as the dominant nation state, and all other nations would be tributary vassal states, including the U.S.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Colonel John Mills, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, thank you. It's such an honor to be on your show with you.
So you've said that all or most regional conflicts in the world actually trace back to communist China. So, justify that for me, because that's a big statement.
Well, right now, we live in a world on fire. We have multiple regional conflicts going on. When you start to break them down, every one of them traces to China, whether it's the American home front and fentanyl, Antifa violence in the streets. It's all that traces to China, whether it's Ukraine, the Middle East, the Americas, whether it's Asia. Now, I also like to use the allegory here that in 1939, in the summer, if you asked a group of experts, was the world in conflict? Summer of 1939. Most would harumph and say, well, no, we have something going on in China, we have something going on in Ethiopia, Spain, the rise of militarism in Germany, etc. But there's not a world war going on. And then in September, they changed their mind when the Germans crossed the border into Poland. But if you look at everything, the world was already on fire in summer of 1939. So all of these things, we're living in a very similar time here. There's multiple regional conflicts. When you break down every one of them, everything traces to communist China, and their focus and intent of dominating the world situation. And really, the book in 1999, Unrestricted Warfare, really was, I would say, in many ways, the tipping point and the articulation of the coordinated campaign of China to be the dominant world power through all measures, unrestricted warfare.
Give me a few examples of how that manifests with this unrestricted warfare.
Well, I would say biological warfare is one of the basics, and that is an actual strategy that China has written. They call it the commanding heights of the showdown with America is biological warfare. You have to look at the Wuhan lab, the chaos created in 2020 by the release of the virus from the lab at Wuhan, and just the mass psychosis that China stoked and leveraged around the world, especially here in the United States.
And that, I think, so Gordon Chang famously says, I say famously because he said it a number of times on this show, that, whether or not this was an intentional release or something like that, it's the way it was used, which basically made it weaponized one way or the other.
I think it's clear.
Yeah.
I was involved in the Team B report that assessed, gave an alternative viewpoint to the virus. And, in the early days, we were attacked, excoriated, anybody who questioned it. But what Gordon said is true, that regardless of whether it was intentional or accidental from the lab, it was absolutely leveraged and exploited, no question about it. But that's just one. But massive theft of intellectual property, massive takedown of market sectors in America to essentially undermine through low price point, steal the intellectual property, and then take over the whole market sector, whether it be small consumer drones or whether it be textiles. That is the Chinese strategy. But it's also a buildup of military forces, which we've now seen. In many cases, China is surpassing American strength, whether it be naval forces or nuclear forces.
You mentioned something about price points. So basically dumping, like for example, cornering the market in solar panels. That's something a lot of people don't realize, that the Chinese Communist Party effectively cornered that entire market, but originally through dumping into the U.S. market and basically having all the local, and I think this is globally, all basically local producers of such things go out of business because they couldn't compete. Why? Because it was part of their industrial policy. It was part of their national security agenda to do that, because now they can leverage that against the United States and others.
Absolutely, and they had a lot of willful help with globalist-minded politicians inside the United States. You mentioned solar panels. It's been shown that a lot of these solar panels are Internet Protocol enabled, meaning they're points on the international network, on the worldwide network. Anything that is a worldwide point on the network can be used both ways. It can be used for intelligence collection. It could be used for remote access. It can be used for remote operation in nefarious ways. So there's nothing good that comes out of that. And absolutely the solar panel campaign, which also has rare earth metals, absolutely a key component of China's strategy. Get us dependent on those solar panels. Well, China builds coal plants at an unbelievable rate.
And on top of everything else, use massive U.S. subsidy money to do it.
Yes.
That's like, I guess, textbook unrestricted warfare or something.
Makes perfect sense. We're funding their malign efforts.
So let's talk just very briefly about these points of conflict, because that's this world on fire. I mean, it's very interesting because in many cases it's not clear, as we realize, like, for example, with these solar panels, it wasn't clear that this is part of the fire. There doesn't seem to be a fire there, but there actually is some kind of fire. Whereas what about the actual conflict zones? Maybe just give me an overview.
I break them up, first of all, to the home front, right here in America. Open borders. We had no idea who was coming across the border during the previous presidential administration. Many of them were Chinese special operators that immediately pivoted to what when they came in? Cannabis operations, muscled in on legal cannabis, cash-rich operation. Cash can't be banked because of federal laws. All kinds of malfeasance can be done when you have lots of cash floating around. Fentanyl over the last few years. Absolutely, 100% from China. Chinese formulary components now assembled in Mexico by the cartels under the supervision of China, Chinese personnel. So right there is the home front. But you got to look at the Americas, the Chinese attempts to really gain control of the Panama Canal, but also Belt and Road initiatives to bag and curry favor throughout the America, including Mexico, Peru, Venezuela, other places. So that's kind of the next front. But you got to look at Ukraine.
But there's a specific relationship with Venezuela, right? As this narco-terrorist.
It is. You got to look at Venezuela as the huge base camp in the Americas for China. It's ungoverned space. This is there's a huge footprint of Chinese operators, of Russian operators, of Iranian operators. This is their base camp for the Americas.
Well, let's start with an obvious conflict area that we've been looking at recently, and that is Iran, Israel, and all of these various proxy groups that Iran has been working with. That's well, maybe let's start with that, because it seems like a number of them have actually been, I don't know, entirely removed almost.
Well, most people have a kind of a stereotype of Middle East tensions and conflict. Oh, it's Arab-Israeli, it's this or that. That's not what's going on nowadays. It's totally different. Everybody needs to totally reframe and update their viewpoints on what's going on in the Middle East. I call it essentially the second part of the world on fire. The first part was Ukraine, and we'll visit that a little bit later. But with Iran would not exist today if it was not for Chinese illegal purchases of sanctioned gas and oil moved on ghost ships from Iran at below market rates, priced in renminbi. So Iran is forced to spend all that renminbi right back in China buying consumer product. So this really is, Iran is a client, a proxy state, and then I call it the 3H club of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, which are the proxies of a proxy. There's not much left of the 3H club. It's about the 0.25H club. Hamas is mostly gone. Still, the issues there are really food, weaponization of food aid, but a new form of food distribution is being used, which cuts Hamas out of the weaponization angle. But there's also the remaining hostages. There's also the weapons that the remainder of Hamas uses to attack the Israelis. But there's also Hezbollah, but they've been mostly or severely decremented by the pager assault, the brilliant pager assault, but also very decisive and moves by Israel to create a buffer zone in the south. So the Houthis are still annoying, still a problem. They've been decremented also, degraded also through attacks by Israel, by the U.S. But the Houthis wouldn't have anything to fire if it wasn't for the flow of war material coming from Iran. And a lot of these rockets and missiles that are being used by Iran, essentially they are Chinese design and or Chinese made or made with Chinese tooling. And a lot of the war material that is made inside of Iran, again with Chinese tooling, is also exported to Russia. So Iran is a proxy and again would not exist. The viability of the regime, of the three-headed regime in Iran, really led by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they'd be broke if it wasn't for Chinese illegal purchases of gas and oil that's sanctioned and moved on ghost fleet ships.
Just to talk a little bit more about the region, also Syria has shifted from an Iran allegiance to, well, I think they're in the process of trying to figure out what kind of relationship they're going to have in the West, if that's even possible. Given the people that basically brought al-Shara to power. So, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, but when it comes to Iran, it seems like that part of the world of fire has been reduced somewhat in the last while.
The Israelis have very effectively, although caught off guard with October 7th by Hamas, the Israelis have rallied and shown decisive, what we call escalation dominance. And it's just another technical term. They've schwacked Iran over and over and over again. So they've seriously degraded the I can't even keep track of who's in charge of the IRGC. It changes so often because the Israeli strikes extremely accurate and effective. Then you have the civilian president, then you have the supreme Ayatollah Khomeini. So, but the Israelis have shown decisive dominance. What is of grave concern now is also this Chinese airlift. I kind of call it a mini Berlin airlift that is ongoing, where it appears China is bringing in new air defense, because the air defense has been essentially wiped out by Israeli and American activity. So that's what's going on. Air defense equipment is relatively light in the spectrum of what needs to be moved as far as war material. So the Chinese are flying in new S-300, S-400 launch units, missiles, and radars to provide new air defense. Grave concern. Are they flying in possible nuke warheads? Don't know. I am sure the Israelis have excellent intelligence on this. They've shown time and again intelligence dominance. And if that was the case, that the Chinese were flying in nukes, I think very likely some of those Chinese 747s would be shot down to send a message.
Flesh out more to me this picture of how the CCP is involved in you mentioned Ukraine earlier.
Well, the no limits agreement with Russia and China was essentially finalized in fall of 2021, and that was essentially an agreement with China and its proxy states, initially just Russia, but to essentially overturn the U.S.-led world system, which is primarily economic. The dollar is the reserve currency. But this was one thing often not understood about China and Russia. They look at the U.S. Operation Desert Storm, which I was in 91, 92, as the perfect military operation, which they study relentlessly. And Ukraine was essentially supposed to be the Desert Storm for Russia. Tactically, the Russians may have momentum. It's not totally clear on that, but now we're in a new era where we're going to give war material to Ukraine to help them resist. The president wants to bring peace and bring peace to this conflict, and so far Putin has not been cooperative. But that is essentially the first major conflagration in the world, and Putin is an absolute proxy, as that he would not exist in power either for the same reasons. Sanctioned gas and oil, moved out of the Baltic on ghost ships over the Arctic to China. Totally, both countries are absolutely dependent on Chinese purchases, and would, frankly, those regimes would not be in power without the purchases by China of sanctioned gas and oil.
You know, it's interesting that the president actually, you know, I think quite prominently kind of allowed those shipments to resume from Iran to China.
I think in the geopolitical play, there might be some reason to allow that. We don't want to see, I mean, I think the president has been clear on we're not seeking regime change. That's not an American item of interest or on the agenda. But I think tactically that might make some sense to allow so that there is some cash flowing so that people do not starve or do not inadvertently create a humanitarian crisis. But I think that can very easily be turned off and turned around once a relook is done to what exactly that funding is going to. If Iran is just rearming, I think that could very easily be shut off.
Well, let's kind of go back to the big picture. You know, kind of give me a picture of how the Chinese Communist Party operates and how this would lead to this world on fire scenario that you were describing.
Well, there are many strategy documents and issuances from Chinese leaders, communist Chinese leaders, that their long-term interest is in essentially establishing world dominance. It's been very clear, but they haven't been able to, they knew it was going to be a long march to establish world dominance. There was many factors that weren't in place, but I think President Xi is feeling the time is right to really essentially in many ways go to Chairman Mao's third stage of conflict, which is open conflict, coming out of the guerrilla insurgency phases. But they've established economic dominance in many ways as being so many U.S. jobs were lost to China when globalists felt, well, what would be wrong with that? Well, everything. But so now all the playing pieces are kind of in place for Xi to make his move around the world to establish China as the dominant nation state, and everything else, all other nations would be tributary vassal states, including the U.S.
And how do they work? Like, for example, you've highlighted the importance of, you know, political and information warfare and what this Chinese Communist Party does.
Well, unfortunately, the American art form on information warfare, some people would call it psychological operations. I think that's a little bit too dramatic. But our art form on statecraft has really deteriorated dangerously. Why? Well, it's because of just it's because of the woke agenda. It's totally poisoned the environment. The Americans are unable to tell their story. Unable. That's the simple part of strategic communication, and information warfare from the Democratic Republic is just telling our side of the story. Incapable of doing that because of the cancer of DEI, wokeism, CRT. But that's being turned around by the Trump administration. But
you mean there's this element of looking at the country negatively, so you can't tell the story positively because you don't believe it yourself. That's kind of what you're saying, or?
Absolutely. How can someone advance the American ideal or the American agenda when they actually don't believe it in their heart of hearts because of just the indoctrination of CRT, DEI, wokeism?
And so how does that relate to the importance of these information and political warfare operations for the Chinese Communist Party?
The Chinese Communist Party prioritizes and values what are called wolf warrior diplomats in a very aggressive information warfare campaign to not just tell their side of the story. There's a difference between somebody telling their side of the story and just plain out lying. Right? There's always going to be a debate and on viewpoints on why something happened. And it's important to tell for somebody to be able to tell their side of the story. That's different what the Chinese are doing. They are absolutely advancing a relentless onslaught of information warfare through their media, through their wolf warriors, to advance a Chinese communist message that just drowns out everything else. And there's no intellectual honesty in their viewpoint. They are never wrong, but you just look at what's going on the home front inside of China. It's a totalitarian system. There are no freedoms. The Chinese Communist Party is dominant, and everybody else is essentially an automaton to carry out the guidance, the roles, the missions, and the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. A massive human rights issue with the Uyghurs, Falun Gong Christians, forced organ harvesting. You have a massive issue with youth unemployment inside of China, food issues inside of China. They've depended on the U.S. for food imports, energy. So there's a whole lot of issues causing severe societal stress inside of China. And what do totalitarians do when they're under pressure at home? Pretty predictable in human history. They strike outward.
So what would you explain to me what the Chinese political warfare strategy is right now?
Part of it is co-opting Western media. And that's broadcast media, but also Hollywood, different Chinese interests. I think it's Tencent Productions, for example, clearly has had a long-term campaign to essentially craft the narrative coming out of Hollywood. It's always pro-China, questioning of the West. Taiwan is part of China. It's a very, very insidious activity there. But with broadcast media, but let's also take the NBA. The NBA is a poster child for what happens with Chinese influence operations. The only place growth exists in the NBA is China. So the NBA is the National Basketball Association is very beholden to what China wants to do. Why? Because the revenue for their teams grows because of the Chinese market. Domestically, they have to compete with other interests of the American family or those spending money on leisure and entertainment, and it's shrinking. So the NBA is a perfect example of shaping the narrative to conform to what the interest of the Chinese Communist Party is.
But how does that manifest? How does the NBA behave differently?
Well, let's say Hong Kong, nobody can question when Hong Kong fell and was taken over in violation of longstanding agreements for sure of Hong Kong. I think it was Enes Kanter, essentially lost his job in the NBA because he spoke out about that, and but others too. Clearly, there was a narrative that had to be followed by players, by teams, and if not, the person or the team was admonished and or fired.
So, which states are aligned with China?
The lineup in the roster is Russia, which is severely, essentially tied down with the Ukraine war. Iran, which has now been severely degraded. But I think you also have to look at North Korea, which has 30,000 or so troops on the battlefield in Ukraine. But I think you also have to put South Africa into this constellation of the axis of China. Pakistan, Pakistan's kind of wavering, but their problem is they've allowed in a very significant Chinese footprint of advisors, of businesses. Belt and Road is a very significant program where use of foreign aid is weaponized by the Chinese, and they prey upon oftentimes countries that essentially can't afford much, and the Chinese come in with a very generous upfront terms and conditions that offer a lot. But in the fine print, there's also collateral that the nation state has to proffer, whether it be a port or some other interest. But that's happened in Sri Lanka, in Kenya, in Pakistan, where essentially those nations have been taken advantage of by payday loan terms and conditions of foreign aid. But they've done that. China's done that in the Americas. And they've taken advantage of an American vacuum where America was just really disengaged from the world and created a vacuum. China says, perfect, fine, we'll step in and take over. But the malign spirit, intent, terms, and conditions of Belt and Road are extremely egregious, extremely abusive, and take advantage of countries that really don't know any better, can't afford anything, and are willing to essentially surrender sovereignty for short-term a bridge, a port, something that they can't afford themselves.